In the spring of 1945, the last and bloodiest battle of the Second World War in Europe took place. The Berlin Offensive was the final carnage of the four-year standoff between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Millions of soldiers, thousands of tanks and planes participated in this battle. A unique newsreel captured the dramatic moments of the storming of the capital of the Third Reich. A rapid offensive. In January 1945, the Red Army launched a large-scale strategic offensive that covered a huge front stretching from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Carpathian Mountains in the south. It was one of the largest offensive operations in the history of the war, involving millions of Soviet soldiers, tens of thousands of guns, tanks, and aircraft. The pace of the Soviet offensive proved staggering. In just 20 days, Soviet troops marched more than 500 kilometers across Poland and East Germany. This rate of advance was unprecedented for the Eastern Front and testified to the complete superiority of the Red Army over the Wehrmacht by the end of the war. During this offensive, the largest Polish cities were liberated: ancient Warsaw, which lay in ruins after the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising, and Kraków, the cultural capital of Poland, which miraculously escaped large-scale destruction. Soviet troops surrounded the powerful German fortresses of Breslau, modern Wrocław, and Königsberg, now Kaliningrad, which Hitler ordered to defend to the last man. By the end of January 1945, Soviet advanced units had crossed the Oder River, the last major water barrier in front of Berlin, and captured several bridgeheads on the West Bank. The advanced units were located only 70 kilometers from the capital of the Third Reich. It seemed that only a few days remained before the fall of Berlin, and the war could end as early as February. However, the German command was not going to give up without a fight. Hitler ordered the transfer of significant reserves from the Western Front to the east, despite the fact that American and British troops were also advancing deep into Germany. This decision showed that the Führer still considered the Eastern Front to be the main threat to the Reich. The transfer of fresh German divisions seriously strengthened the defenses on the outskirts of Berlin. An attempt by Soviet troops to capture the city of Kustrin, an important stronghold on the west bank of the Oder, ended in failure. The German troops put up fierce resistance, using every house as a fortress. The chief of the General Staff of the German Army, Colonel General Heinz Guderian, one of the creators of the German tank doctrine, developed a counteroffensive plan codenamed Solstice. This plan provided for a powerful counterattack by the 11th SS Panzer Army on the flanks of the Soviet troops that reached the Oder. The German counteroffensive began on February 15, 1945. Selected SS units equipped with heavy tanks Royal Tiger and Panther inflicted a heavy blow on the positions of the Soviet troops. The fighting became fierce, with both sides suffering heavy losses in men and equipment. Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, commander of the First Belarusian Front, personally led the repulse of the German counterattack. The Soviet defense withstood, the German offensive was stopped and pushed back. However, these battles showed that the Wehrmacht still retains the ability to resist seriously, and the offensive on Berlin had to be postponed for additional training. While Zhukov's troops were fighting fiercely on the Oder bridgeheads, serious problems arose on the northern flank of the Soviet offensive. The Second Belarusian Front, under the command of Marshal Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, advanced much more slowly than planned. The reason for the slow pace of the offensive was an acute shortage of reserves and logistical support. Rokossovsky's troops operated in the difficult conditions of East Prussia and Pomerania, where the Germans created a deeply echeloned defense and used advantageous terrain for stubborn resistance. Zhukov could not provide assistance to the neighboring front, as all his forces were involved in expanding and holding the bridgeheads on the west bank of the Oder. The Soviet command was faced with a dilemma: either to continue preparations for an attack on Berlin with an unprotected northern flank, or to postpone the operation until the front line was aligned. Supreme Commander Joseph Stalin made a decision. He ordered the deployment of a significant part of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front troops to the north to help Rokossovsky defeat the German group in Pomerania. This decision delayed the offensive on Berlin for several weeks, but ensured the safety of the flanks and created the conditions for the successful conduct of a decisive operation. The joint strikes of Zhukov and Rokossovsky's troops in March 1945 brought the expected results. The German group in Pomerania was defeated, tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. The northern flank of the Soviet troops was secured, and it was possible to return to plans for an offensive against Berlin. The situation on the southern flank has also improved. The First Ukrainian Front, under the command of Marshal Ivan Stepanovich Konev, completed the defeat of German troops in Silesia and pulled up to the Oder south of Berlin. Now the German capital was under threat of attack from two directions at once, from the east Zhukov's troops and from the southeast Konev's troops. The military situation was becoming more and more favorable for the Red Army. The front line was leveled, the flanks were secured, the troops were replenished with people and equipment, and the necessary ammunition and fuel supplies were created. Everything was ready for the final decisive blow. However, at this time, a new factor arose that forced the Soviet command to accelerate preparations for the offensive. Anglo-American troops on the Western Front were rapidly advancing deep into Germany, encountering relatively weak resistance. The Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced rapidly to the east. The race for Berlin has begun. Stalin was seriously afraid that the Western Allies might try to capture Berlin first, despite the preliminary agreements on the occupation zones of Germany. The capture of the German capital was not only of military, but also of great political importance. Whoever takes Berlin will determine the post-war structure of Europe. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe, really considered the possibility of a quick attack on Berlin. The advanced American tank units were located only 100 kilometers from the German capital, about the same distance as the Soviet troops. In the end, Eisenhower abandoned plans to attack Berlin, believing that the losses would be too great and the political benefits would not justify the military sacrifices. However, Stalin could not be sure of the intentions of the Allies and insisted on the early start of the Berlin operation. Planning an assault, Zhukov's First Belarusian Front was tasked with delivering the main attack on Berlin from the east, from the Oder bridgeheads. Zhukov's troops had to overcome three powerful German defense lines, sequentially built on the outskirts of the capital. The first line of defense ran directly along the western bank of the Oder. The Germans turned every town and village into a fortified point with a well-developed system of trenches, anti-tank ditches and firing points. The second line of defense was located on the Zalowski Heights, a natural elevation dominating the surrounding area. From these heights, German artillery and tanks could control all the approaches to Berlin. The capture of the Zalowski Heights was the key to breaking through the German defenses. The third line of defense ran along the outskirts of Berlin itself. The city was turned into a real fortress with numerous barricades, anti-tank barriers, minefields and fortified buildings. The Soviet command concentrated huge forces to capture Berlin. The operation was to involve three fronts totaling more than 2.5 million people, about 42,000 guns and mortars, more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled artillery units, and about 8,000 aircraft. It was one of the most powerful groups of troops in the history of mankind. The Soviet offensive on Berlin began on the night of April 16, 1945. 2 hours before the start of the infantry attack, the most powerful artillery training began. More than 40,000 guns and mortars unleashed a barrage of fire on the German positions. The roar of the cannonade could be heard from dozens of kilometers away. The ground shook from the exploding shells, the sky was illuminated by flashes of gunfire and explosions. The German soldiers who were on the front line went through a real hell. Many fortifications were destroyed, communications were disrupted, and command and control was paralyzed. Simultaneously with the artillery strike, the Soviet command used an unusual tactical novelty. 143 searchlights were directed at German positions. The blinding light was supposed to disorient the enemy and facilitate the advance of the Soviet infantry. However, this technique was not as effective as expected. In the conditions of smoke and dust from shell explosions, the light of the searchlights was partially reflected back, making it difficult for the attackers to see. After completing the artillery training, the Soviet infantry and tanks went on the attack. However, the German defense proved to be more solid than expected. Many German soldiers survived the shelling in deep shelters and now opened intense fire on the attackers. The fighting was particularly fierce on the Zalowski Heights. The German troops used the advantageous position of the terrain and conducted intense fire from all types of weapons. Soviet tanks struggled up the steep slopes under fire from anti-tank guns and Faust cartridges. The offensive progressed more slowly than planned. Zhukov, who was watching the battle from his command post, made a risky decision. He ordered the deployment of two tank armies, Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army and Bogdanov's 2nd Guards Tank Army, ahead of schedule. This decision violated the Stavka Directive, which ordered tank armies to be deployed in a breakthrough only after rifle formations had broken through the enemy's main line of defense. Zhukov took this step in an effort to accelerate the pace of the offensive and prevent the Germans from organizing a solid defense on the next frontiers. The introduction of tank armies into battle in a narrow area led to a serious problem. Huge traffic jams of tanks, self-propelled guns, artillery and trucks formed on the roads. Command and control of the troops became more complicated, the pace of the offensive did not accelerate, and losses increased. Zhukov later admitted that this decision was a mistake. While Zhukov's troops were gnawing through the German defenses on the Zolovsky Heights with great difficulty, more favorable events were developing in the southern sector of the front. The troops of Konev's First Ukrainian Front broke through the German defenses south of Berlin and advanced rapidly. Konev used more flexible tactics than Zhukov. He did not storm the fortified positions with a frontal attack, but looked for weak points in the enemy's defense and struck at these areas. In addition, the defense south of Berlin was objectively weaker than in the main direction of Zhukov's strike. The successful advance of Konev's troops threatened to encircle Berlin from the south and forced the German command to transfer reserves from other sectors. This weakened the defense in front of Zhukov's troops and made it easier for them to break through. A kind of competition has developed between the two Soviet marshals, who will be the first to break into Berlin. Stalin skillfully used this rivalry to boost the ambitions of both commanders. He even adjusted the dividing line between the fronts in such a way that Konev's troops were able to attack Berlin from the south. By April 18, after 3 days of fierce fighting, Soviet troops had finally broken through the German defenses on the Zolovsky Heights. The German units, which had suffered huge losses, began to retreat to Berlin. The way to the German capital was open. Soviet tank and mechanized units rushed forward, trying to prevent the enemy from gaining a foothold on new frontiers. The advanced detachments advanced 30 to 40 kilometers per day, bypassing the resistance points and rushing to the outskirts of Berlin. On April 19, the advanced units reached the suburbs of the German capital. Preparations for the storming of the city had begun. The Soviet command was well aware that the fighting in a major city would be extremely difficult and bloody. Hitler ordered Berlin to be turned into an impregnable fortress and defended to the last man. The city was indeed carefully prepared for defense. The streets were blocked by massive barricades of cobblestones, tramcars, wrecked cars, and anything else that could be used. Many buildings were turned into fortified strongholds. The windows of the lower floors were laid with bricks or sandbags, and embrasures were pierced in the walls for firing. Shelters for the defenders were set up in the basements, snipers and machine gunners were stationed in the attics. Berlin's wide avenues were bombarded by anti-tank guns and tanks mounted in shelters. The intersections were controlled by firing points. Underground utilities, subways, sewers, basements were used for the covert movement of troops. Everyone who could hold a weapon was involved in the defense of the city. In addition to regular Wehrmacht troops and SS units, the Volkssturm People's Militia of the elderly and teenagers, policemen, firefighters, and even the Hitler Youth participated in the battles. Many of these people had no military training and were doomed to die. On April 21, Soviet troops stormed into Berlin and fierce street fighting ensued. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in tens and even individual meters. Every house had to be stormed, every street cleared of the enemy in fierce battles. The Soviet command applied special urban warfare tactics developed in the battles for Stalingrad, Budapest and other cities. Assault groups were created, consisting of infantry machine gunners, sappers with explosives, flamethrowers and gunners. Support was provided by tanks or self-propelled guns, which destroyed enemy fortifications with direct fire. The assault groups acted as follows. First, artillery and tanks suppressed enemy firing points in the building, then sappers blew up walls or doors, after which machine gunners broke inside and cleared the premises of enemies. The fighting went on floor by floor, from room to room. The tactic of advancing through gaps in the walls was widely used to avoid shelling in the streets. Soviet sappers blew up the walls between neighboring houses, and the assault groups advanced without going out into the bullet-riddled streets. The German defense, despite the desperate resistance of individual units, gradually crumbled. Command and control of the troops was disrupted, communication between the various units was lost, and the supply of ammunition and food practically stopped. Adolf Hitler was in an underground bunker under the Reich Chancellery in the center of Berlin, surrounded by a small group of loyal confidants. The Führer was still giving orders to non-existent armies, demanding counterattacks from divisions that had long since ceased to exist, accusing everyone around of betrayal. On April 30, General Helmut Weidling was appointed commandant of Berlin and head of the city's defense. He was an experienced military leader, a realist who understood that the defense of the city was doomed. However, he continued to fulfill his duty, organizing the defense with the available forces. At the same time, Hitler was still hoping for outside help. He ordered General Wenck's 12th Army, located southwest of Berlin, to break through to the capital and unblock the encircled city. However, Wenck's army was itself surrounded by Soviet troops and could not come to the rescue. On April 30, 1945, when Soviet troops were only a few hundred meters from the Führer's bunker, Adolf Hitler and his wife Eva Braun, whom he had married the day before, committed suicide. Hitler shot himself. Eva Braun took poison. The bodies were taken upstairs, doused with gasoline and burned in the courtyard of the Reich Chancellery under artillery fire. The Führer's closest associates wanted to avoid a situation where Hitler's body would fall into the hands of Soviet troops and be put on public display, as happened with Mussolini's body in Italy. Hitler's death meant the de facto end of the Third Reich. The regime he created and ruled for 12 years, which unleashed the bloodiest war in human history, collapsed with him. On May 1st, Soviet troops began storming the building of the German parliament, the Reichstag. Hoisting the red flag over the Reichstag meant declaring victory over Nazi Germany to the whole world. The Reichstag building was turned by the Germans into a powerful fortified post. Thick walls, basements, and interior spaces allowed for long-term defense. The garrison numbered several thousand soldiers and officers, determined to fight to the end. The assault on the Reichstag lasted all day. Soviet troops broke into the building, fought in the corridors and halls, climbed the stairs to the upper floors under enemy fire. By evening, the scouts of the 150th Infantry Division, Egorov and Kantaria, hoisted the Red Victory banner on the roof of the Reichstag. After Hitler's death and the capture of the Reichstag, German resistance in Berlin rapidly weakened. On May 2nd, the commandant of Berlin, General Weidling, accepted the offer of surrender. He ordered all German units in the city to cease resistance and surrender. The mass surrender of German soldiers and officers began. More than 130,000 people were captured in Berlin itself. Tens of thousands of prisoners from the group surrounded around the capital also surrendered in the following days. On May 3rd, the fighting in Berlin completely stopped. Soviet soldiers rejoiced, celebrating the victory on the streets of the destroyed city. It was a victory that they deserved at the cost of incredible sacrifices and efforts. The Berlin operation was one of the bloodiest in the history of the Great Patriotic War. About 80,000 Soviet soldiers and officers died in the battles for Berlin. Many thousands more were injured. These were huge losses at the very end of the war, when victory was already obvious. The German losses were even greater. About 100,000 German soldiers died in the battles for Berlin, and more than 130,000 were captured. Tens of thousands of civilians in the city were also killed, caught between two fighting armies. The city was reduced to ruins. Soviet artillery and aircraft, despite attempts to minimize the destruction, nevertheless caused serious damage to the architecture of Berlin. Many historical buildings were destroyed or seriously damaged. After the fall of Berlin, the war in Europe was not over yet. In Czechoslovakia, large groups of German troops continued to fight, trying to break through to the west in order to surrender to American and British troops, avoiding Soviet captivity. Two Soviet tank armies began a rapid advance towards Prague. The Soviet command sought to cut off the escape routes of the German troops to the west and force them to capitulate. This advance took place at an incredible speed. Tank columns marched 80 to 100 kilometers per day. On May 9, 1945, the Act of Unconditional Surrender of Germany was signed in Karlshorst, a suburb of Berlin. On behalf of the German High Command, the document was signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. On behalf of the Allied powers, the act was adopted by Marshal Georgy Zhukov from the USSR and British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder from the Western Allies. This document meant the complete and final defeat of Nazi Germany. The war in Europe, which lasted for almost 6 years and claimed the lives of tens of millions of people, has ended.